Welcome back. We're on to lecture 4. I mentioned in lecture 3 two proposed mechanisms of patriarchy that I didn't take up: the alleged social construction and sustaining of biological sex categories, and the social construction and sustaining of gender, understood as gender norms. Now, I'm not saying alleged in the case of the former but not the latter to signal a kind of foregone conclusion about biological sex categories, but rather because social construction is built in to the concept of gender as gender norms. That is to say, only what is socially constructed is gender rather than sex. And this will be important again in lecture 5 when we talk about femininity. Today we'll turn to these mechanisms by way of turning to their corresponding solutions: sex category abolitionism and gender abolitionism. Before we do that, 2 notes. First, anyone familiar with current gender politics is likely to wonder about the more moderate solution of what we might call gender revisionism rather than gender abolitionism. Maybe gender norms just need a few tweaks so that we get rid of the most harmful ones, or we let more people opt out. We'll return to this idea in lecture 9 when we talk about trans inclusion. We'll focus on the more radical solutions in this lecture. Second, as an answer to how to solve patriarchy, abolish sex categories and abolish gender norms might seem strange. Why is this lecture not about more practical and readily available solutions, like getting young girls involved with sports and STEM? My first response is that this is a philosophy course, meaning it takes up issues where there are interesting ideas to be worked through rather than practical implementation challenges to solve. That doesn't mean that other solutions aren't excellent solutions. It just means that they're not our focus when it comes to thinking about solutions. And my second response is that these 2 solutions we'll discuss today are exciting solutions because they are big and visionary. We can think them through and decide whether they're worth aiming at long term, even while we work on the shorter term and more practical solutions that might help to improve women's situation. That being said, many feminists did advance what we would now think of as more practical and readily available solutions. Although at the time they dreamed them up, they may have seemed just as remote as gender abolitionism seems to us now. Think about beginning to demand the vote for women in a world in which only white men could vote, or beginning to demand an equal education for women in a world in which only sons were educated. Some of the early feminist liberals, like Mary Wollstonecraft, who published A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, and later Harriet Taylor Mill around the mid-1800s, argued that one obvious way to give men and women equal opportunity was to give them equal education. Olympe de Gouges, in her Declaration of the Rights of Women in 1791, argued for equal rights with men for women under the law. Some of the second wavers worked for legal rights for women, such as against marital rape or for fair divorce settlements, or against rape or workplace sexual harassment. Some, like Mary Daly, focused on language reform, on the basis that patriarchy can have its clutches deep in language, meaning that we can't fully escape it without changing that language. And I'll link to a Feminist Heretics video on Daly's language reform projects in the video description. Some, like Susanna Budapest in her 1979 The Holy Book of Women's Mysteries, focused on building women's spirituality as a specific form of women's culture. And some, like Christine de Pizan, leaned into the idea of sex complementarity, but focused on emphasizing the virtues of women, a kind of revaluation of women that would increase her status and standing. Work taken over later by cultural feminists or difference feminists, who today call themselves sex realist feminists or reactionary feminists. And you can find many contributors representing this viewpoint over at Farrer Disputations. I'll put some references in the video description for anyone who wants to follow up on these ideas, but we'll now turn to sex category abolitionism. French feminist Monique Wittig, in her 1976 essay The Category of Sex, writes that social differences always come from politics, economics, or ideology, and that those who benefit from them, the masters, explain away the differences as being natural, while those who are exploited by them, the slaves, also see them as natural, but think that social oppositions have been built out of them. If we think of a time before there was social struggle between groups, we imagine a time where there was merely difference, without opposition being built upon the difference. Instead of accepting that there is difference and it is natural, so that the only question is whether there is social opposition and what form it takes, a third possibility is to reject the idea that there is any natural difference at all. Wittig takes this line, asserting that there is no sex, that oppression creates sex and not the contrary. She denies that there is any natural division of the sexes pre-existing or outside of society. Class struggle abolishes classes and makes all people the same. So too should the class struggle between women and men, which will abolish the contradictions between the sexes. Wittig is motivated by women's situation at the time. She writes of women doing the bulk of domestic labor, the work of reproduction, and being murdered, mutilated, physically and mentally tortured and abused, being raped, being battered, and being constrained to marriage as the fate of women. Once women come to understand this, then there is opposition between women and men, there is political struggle. She asks, why do we think there are sexes? That they are already there before thought and before society. She seems to be saying that thinking in terms of difference is domination, as in the way that dominators think because it is to their advantage. And because their body of thought has had so much influence, we all end up thinking like that, whether we are dominators or dominated. This dominance thinking tells us that there are sexes, understood as two categories of individuals born, and the difference between them has ontological consequences, that the sexes are naturally or biologically or hormonally or genetically different, and that there is a natural division of labor in the family. Note that the first two claims, that there are sexes and that this has ontological consequences, seem quite different from the last claim, that there is a natural division of labor in the family. Ontological consequences on the normal philosophical usage would mean consequences for what exists in the world. So I suppose here must mean that there really are men and women, boys and girls, rather than, for example, only humans. We could agree that there are sexes and that sex differences have these consequences, but we could disagree that anything follows from there being men and women, boys and girls, about the natural division of labor in the family. In Lecture 2, we talked about Caelan O'Connor's view that we would expect to see a division of labor based on human types emerge to solve complementary coordination problems, but that there need not be anything natural about this in the sense that we have to make any claims about what women are naturally good at or naturally suited to. The only claims we made were physiological, about strength differences and reproductive differences, making it more efficient for men to do particular jobs and women to do particular jobs. Wittig's worry is that if we think of sex differences and the relation between these two categories of persons as natural, then we won't think of them as social, and so we won't see them as something contingent or up for change. This ends up concealing the fact that one such category has come to dominate the other, and that in order to do so, the dominant ideology needs us to keep believing in the categories. Otherwise, who would dominate who? From Wittig's perspective, the category of sex does not exist a priori before all society and is only a product of social dominance. She says, the category of sex is the product of heterosexual society that turns half of the population into sexual beings, for sex is a category which women cannot be outside of. The category of sex is the category that sticks to women, for only they cannot be conceived outside of it. Only they are sex, the sex, and sex they have been made in their minds, bodies, acts, gestures. Even their murders and beatings are sexual. Indeed, the category of sex tightly holds women. Notice here she has moved from biological sex to the act of sex, presumably via women's role in reproduction, which requires the having of sex, which turns women into things that are for sex. Here she is in agreement with MacKinnon, who we'll talk about soon. Her proposed remedy is abolition of the sex categories. She says, the category of sex is a totalitarian one. It grips our minds in such a way that we cannot think outside of it. This is why we must destroy it and start thinking beyond it if we want to start thinking at all, as we must destroy the sexes as a sociological reality if we want to start to exist. Wittig is not the only feminist of the second wave to suggest sex elimination as a solution. Marilyn Frye, in some parts of her work, although not in others, seems to have this view, as does Catherine MacKinnon. Frye notes that we are constantly announcing our sex through our dress, comportment, speech, and behavior. She says it is precisely this marking of difference that the dominance-subordination relations of sex class depend on. The oppression of women could not exist were not the groups, the categories of persons, well defined. The barriers and forces could not be suitably located and applied if there were often much doubt as to which individuals were to be contained and reduced, which were to dominate. Here the thought seems to be that if we stopped announcing our sexes, then it wouldn't be clear which people were meant to be subordinated, and so subordination would have to cease. If you can't tell who's meant to be in the inferior group and who's meant to be in the superior group, then you just can't operate with those class lines anymore. Still, note that she talks about the announcing of sex, meaning that sex would become harder to detect socially. She is not denying that there is sex. So she may be more accurately classed as being between these two approaches of sex abolitionism and gender abolitionism, in wanting the end of gender by way of the end of sex detection in ordinary social life. We could presumably know as an abstract fact that the population divides roughly 50-50 into males and females, while being a lot more confounded about which individuals are male and which are female. There's a separate question to ask about her strategy. Is it really the case that enough of us could confound sex announcing to the degree necessary to avoid detection and make sex caste lines impossible? Well, I think this wouldn't just keep the more obviously sexed people in castes and free up a few people who were able to pull off perfect androgyny. Well, I think the dominators would care about a sexually ambiguous minority. Are we to suppose they're more scared of accidentally subordinating a male than accidentally advantaging a female, so that they wouldn't do the latter for fear of the former? There's lots to think through in this proposal. Finally, Catherine MacKinnon. In a familiar way of thinking about sex and gender, sex comes first. There is sex, which means there is reproductive difference, which provides the basis for a particular division of labor or dependency, and then things run from there, leading to or constructing gender. More and more social and cultural ideas get packed into what it means to be female, like single drops of water forming over a long period of time into a stalactite. The solution may seem to be to attack that social and cultural stuff directly. We'll talk about that under the heading of gender abolitionism. But MacKinnon flips this story. For her, domination comes first and literally creates sex. She doesn't ask, how does sex become sex class, but rather, how does class create sex? And she thinks the answer is via sexuality. In her words, the molding, direction, and expression of sexuality organizes society into two sexes, women and men, which division underlies the totality of social relations. Sexuality is that social process which creates, organizes, expresses, and directs desire, creating the social beings we know as women and men, as their relations create society. Sexuality is the unifying core of so many issues feminists were already concerned with, including abortion, birth control, rape, incest, sexual harassment, prostitution, sex trafficking, and pornography. She thinks feminists had been unmasking the social attitudes that normalized these treatments of her and showing that she had been socially constructed in ways connected to her sexuality, in other words, as being for sexual use by men. It sounds at some points like it's the socialization, not the sex, that is the problem. For example, when she says, gender socialization is the process through which women come to identify themselves as sexual beings, as beings that exist for men. You have to have women first in order to have a people who identify themselves as sexual, as existing for men. So this doesn't sound initially sex abolitionist. But then she says sex as gender and sex as sexuality are thus defined in terms of each other. But it is sexuality that determines gender, not the other way around. She says, women and men are divided by gender, made into the sexes as we know them, by the social requirements of heterosexuality, which institutionalizes male sexual dominance and female sexual submission. If this is true, sexuality is the linchpin of gender inequality. Here's one way to understand this, with thanks to Kate Phelan. McKinnon thinks that there are two distinct groups of people. One group which eroticizes dominance, and the other group which eroticizes subordination. Because the group who eroticize dominance happen to share certain features, like having a penis, and the group who eroticize subordination happen to share certain features, like having a vulva, these characteristics themselves come to have social meaning attached to or interrelated with the group's broader traits of being dominant or being subordinated. But this link is incidental. The physical features don't really have all that meaning that we've packed into them. Maybe sex difference is literally as insignificant as having bigger or smaller ears, or bonier or more cushioned kneecaps, or some other silly physical difference like that. McKinnon then is a social constructionist about sex. She thinks that we, with our social practices, have quite literally created sex. There are no real differences between humans, just two arbitrary groups who have sexualized social hierarchy. In Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, she says, in radical feminism, the condition of the sexes and the relevant definition of woman as a group is conceived as social down to the somatic level. Indeed, she identifies the view that sex is natural and objective with liberal feminism, which is interesting because this identification has flipped today, with liberal feminists being more likely to deny sex and radical feminists being more likely to insist upon it. Unfortunately, McKinnon offers no origin story for how all this got started, so it is a mystery why the groups subordinator and subordinated should so perfectly track these genital differences. Here's another way to understand it. Sexuality is the linchpin of gender inequality. Fine, it divides men and women and makes them into the sexes as we know them. That might just mean we think they are much more than they actually are. They are only different reproductive roles, and we have made them into huge amounts of social and cultural baggage as well. Just think of all the ideas connected to femininity and masculinity, even if you restrict the scope to those with some connection to sexuality. On this understanding, McKinnon is not necessarily with Wittig and Fry in thinking that we have to get rid of sex categories altogether, or get rid of the social marking and detection of sex in order to get rid of the male-female social hierarchy. She may only be committed to thinking that we need a radical revision of sexuality, and that would change our ideas about what biological sex is to something much more minimalist. But there might still be something, and there it would be okay to have sex categories and talk about males and females where there were relevant differences to talk about. The reasoning behind sex abolition seems to be a parallel of the reasoning about anti-racism. That is, if we think there really are races as a biological fact, then we are likely to build racism on top of them to naturalize the inferiority of some relative to others. Scientists work to show that races are not natural categories and that there is as much variation within racial groups as there is between them. Races do not carve nature at its joints, as philosophers like to say. If we apply the same reasoning to sex, then it's easy enough to see how we end up at sex abolitionism. All of the work going into denying the sex binary today in the name of intersex rights, trans rights, and some types of feminism can be understood as a version of trying to do for sex and sexism what was already done for race and racism. The problem is the disanalogy. There really are physiological sex differences, and they are not as superficial as racial differences, and they do carve nature at its joints. That is to say, there really are two categories of bodies, even if there is a very small percentage of people with variation between 0.015% and 0.37%, depending whose numbers you trust, which in turn depends on exactly what gets classified as variation. Philosophers who work on social construction identify things like birthdays, marriages, universities, and money as being socially constructed, and things like planets and lakes and bonobos as existing regardless of society. Sex belongs in the category of planets and lakes and bonobos. Moreover, these physiological differences can be significant. Females, but not males, meaning not all females but only females, will have the range of experiences from menstruation, pregnancy, and relatedly miscarriage, infertility, ectopic pregnancy and other pregnancy issues, childbirth, breastfeeding, and menopause. Females, but not males, will have average differences in size and strength, which create differential capacities that are relevant to both sport, some jobs, and to vulnerability in some contexts. All of this has taken on political significance under thousands of years of patriarchy, so that to correct some of the ways in which women have been excluded, it is helpful to be able to put measures and protections in place to, for example, increase women's participation, say, in politics. Many feminists resist the idea that we should abolish sex, because sex matters politically, at least for now, and helps us to make things right morally. They want us to acknowledge sex, but work to get rid of women's sex-based subordination. A useful parallel to that feminist position is taking a colorblind approach to race, which some people of color have pushed back on, saying that if you don't see race, then you don't see racism, and that it's important to acknowledge race so that you acknowledge the likely very different experience that a person of color has had growing up in a racist society. People marked as being of particular races might want to keep some version of a race concept in order to advocate for their political rights. Okay, part 3, the social construction of gender. Let me frame this idea through one of the characters in Joanna Russ's The Female Man, a brilliant feminist sci-fi novel from 1975, who gives a powerful articulation to the distinction between being female and having been socialized into femininity, which she's calling being woman. I love my body dearly, and yet I would copulate with a rhinoceros if I could become not a woman. There is the vanity training, the obedience training, the self-effacement training, the deference training, the dependency training, the passivity training, the rivalry training, the stupidity training, the placation training. How am I to put this together with my human life, my intellectual life, my solitude, my transcendence, my brains, and my fearful ambition? I failed miserably and thought it was my own fault. You can't unite woman and human any more than you can unite matter and antimatter. They are designed not to be stable together, and they make just as big an explosion inside the head of the unfortunate girl who believes in both. The girl, the person with the female body, is fully human, but she is trained in a million ways into a femininity that makes her subordinate to men. This is the sex-gender distinction that was commonplace during the second wave. The distinction between woman, the human, and woman as she is made to be by sex-separated socialization. Or another way to put it, for those who like to use female for sex and woman for successful enculturation into femininity, which some feminists do today, that would be the distinction between female, the human, and woman, the enculturated female. Or the female who has been subject to attempts to make her feminine, even if those attempts ultimately failed. Or consider Simone de Beauvoir, writing in chapter 1 of The Second Sex, published in 1949. This chapter is called Biological Data. Beauvoir writes, "Males and females are two types of individuals who are differentiated within one species for the purposes of reproduction. Furthermore, we are our bodies. A consciousness without a body or an immortal human being is rigorously inconceivable." Beauvoir talks about how the woman's role in reproduction creates specific stages in her life: periods, pregnancy, childbirth, menopause. She says, "Because the body is the instrument of our hold upon the world appears different to us depending on how it is grasped." She goes on, "But we refuse the idea that they," the data about women's bodies she's been discussing in the chapter, "form a fixed destiny for her. They do not suffice to constitute a basis for a sexual hierarchy. They do not explain why woman is the other. They do not condemn her forever after to this subjugated role." Beauvoir is very clear that while there are real biological and physiological differences between the sexes, they do not ground values. Men on average have superior strength to women, but if men respected or feared women, then they wouldn't wield that superior strength against women as violence. Her conclusion in the chapter is that her body is not enough to define her, meaning that her physicality alone cannot justify her subordination. To explain that, we must consider her biology in light of economic, social, and psychological considerations, which she then goes on in the book to do. Beauvoir's most famous line, today much misunderstood, comes at the start of her chapter, Childhood. This is the first chapter in part 1 of volume 2. The title of volume 2 is Lived Experience, going first through the formative years of childhood, girlhood, and sexual initiation before talking about lesbians. In part 2, she carries on to women's situation, talking about the married woman, the mother, women's social life, prostitution, the period from maturity into old age, and women's situation more generally. Here's the famous line in context. "One is not born, but rather becomes woman. No biological, psychical, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates this intermediary product between the male and the eunuch that is called feminine." And let me just interrupt myself to say that it is honestly worth memorizing the second line. No biological, psychical, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. Given the number of who cite Beauvoir in support of the idea that a man can become a woman, it is absolutely clear from the very next line that she is saying a female need not become a woman, and not that anyone can become a woman if they want to. Okay, continuing that paragraph, only the mediation of another can constitute an individual as an other. Inasmuch as he exists for himself, the child would not grasp himself as sexually differentiated. If well before puberty, and sometimes even starting from early childhood, she already appears sexually specified, it is not because mysterious instincts immediately destine her to passivity, coquetry, or motherhood, but because the intervention of others in the infant's life is almost originary, and her vocation is imperiously breathed into her from the first years of her life. What this means is, yes, she is female. Yes, if she decides to reproduce, then she will have the pregnancy/childbirth role instead of the insemination role. But that doesn't determine what she will be like as a person. It doesn't make her passive or flirtatious or give her all the character traits we associate with ideal mothers. Her biology does not define her, society does that. That's what it means to say that it is civilization as a whole that elaborates the idea of the feminine. It then pushes this idea onto her. Her vocation is imperiously breathed into her from her first years of life is an eloquent way of saying those around her enculturate her into femininity because she is female. This is socialization on the basis of sex, females being made feminine and males being made masculine, which the second wave feminists began to refer to as gender. Sex is what she really is, the minimal biological truth of her, and gender is how she is made to be, or at least how society attempts to make her be, namely feminine. Although, of course, some women throughout history have been spirited enough to resist these attempts and to be women in their own way. If this is the problem, then the solution is obvious. Stop socializing women into femininity. It's worth returning to the earlier point about terminology here, namely the difference between the sex-gender distinction and sex-gender terms and the argument over them. In saying one is not born but rather becomes woman, it may seem that what she really is female, and then she is only woman if she is socialized successfully. Most female people are successfully socialized into femininity, at least to some extent, because it's easy to socialize children. So most female people will be women on this way of using words. I think that is why some feminists today have decoupled woman from female and use woman to refer to a form of femininity, used very expansively to include as a form of femininity, saying that you're female or that you're a woman, whether you are or not. Beauvoir's usage kicked off a whole history of feminists then using female for the biology and woman for the social stuff, which some people, including me, now think is entirely unhelpful. For some recent discussion on this point, see for example Alex Burns' 2024 book Trouble with Gender. Part 4. 21 years after Beauvoir, and indeed dedicating her book to Beauvoir, Shulamith Firestone wrote The Dialectic of Sex, which was one of the first 3 radical feminist monographs, all published in 1970. The other 2 being Kate Millett's Sexual Politics and Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. Firestone is also very much a realist about sex and sex difference, but unlike Beauvoir, Firestone thinks that women's reproductive role does play a determining role in her subordination. Firestone opens her book with the statement, "Sex class is so deep as to be invisible." She goes on, "Or it may appear as a superficial inequality, one that can be solved by merely a few reforms, or perhaps by the full integration of women into the labor force. But the reaction of the common man, woman, and child, that, why, you can't change that, you must be out of your mind, is the closest to the truth. We are talking about something every bit as deep as that. This gut reaction, the assumption that even when they don't know it, feminists are talking about changing a fundamental biological condition, is an honest one. That so profound a change cannot be easily fitted into the traditional categories of thought, for example, political, is not because these categories do not apply, but because they are not big enough. Radical feminism bursts through them. If there were another word more all-embracing than revolution, we would use it. People react to feminists as attempting the impossible, trying to change a fundamental biological condition. Firestone is talking about sex class, the oppression or at least subordination of a social group based on their sex, being female. The question is whether she thinks the class is because of the sex in some determining way, or the relationship is more contingent in the ways we've been talking about in previous lectures. And it seems that she takes the first view, that the class is because of the sex. She says, we are dealing with a larger problem, with an oppression that goes back beyond recorded history to the animal kingdom itself. So the problem seems to be sex division or sex difference, that then causes class and takes us to a situation in which women are subordinated. She says a bit later in the first chapter, sex class sprang directly from a biological reality. Men and women were created different and not equal. Firestone thinks men's and women's different reproductive roles led to the creation of the biological family, man, woman, children, and that this family is characterized by 4 facts. Biological dependence. For all of history, up until when birth control was invented, women were at the mercy of their biology, and this made them dependent on the men and their families and societies for survival. Second, infant-child dependence. Human children have a lengthy period of dependency compared to other animals. Third, evolutionary psychology. Infant mother dependencies throughout evolutionary history have shaped women's psychologies. And fourth, division of labor, that reproductive differences between the sexes led to a division of labor at the origins of class, furnishing the paradigm of caste, discrimination based on biological characteristics. As we have talked about now several times already, for example in Robert Max Jackson's work and in Gerda Lerner's work, reproductive differences led to a particular division of labor. But in Firestone's view, this is not merely the accident at the start of social hierarchy that is then sustained by other mechanisms. For Firestone, women's reproductive role determines her subordination because it makes her dependent on men, and she was unable to escape that dependency until birth control was invented. Firestone thought that women needed to be freed from her reproductive role in order to be freed from the division of labor and so from sex-based subordination. She advocated for artificial reproduction to that end. She writes, drawing on Marxism, justice to assure elimination of economic classes required the revolt of the underclass, the proletariat, and in a temporary dictatorship, their seizure of the means of production. So, to assure the elimination of the sexual classes requires the revolt of the underclass, women, and the seizure of control of reproduction. Not only the full restoration to women of ownership of their own bodies, but also their temporary seizure of control of human fertility, the new population biology, as well as all the social institutions of childbearing and child rearing. And just as the end goal of socialist revolution was not only the elimination of the economic class privilege, but of the economic class division itself, so the end goal of feminist revolution must be, unlike that of the first feminist movement, not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. One can read Firestone as a sex abolitionist, given that she says she wants to get rid of the sex distinction, but one can also read her as a gender abolitionist, because it's the genital differences mattering culturally that she's targeting, not the fact of genital differences and the bigger sex differences behind them themselves. It's consistent with Firestone's vision for a feminist future that there are two acknowledged sexes and some acknowledged differences between them, so long as there is not class based on those differences. Let's finish by taking a look at a piece in the 1973 collection Radical Feminism, an essay by Bonnie Krebs. This piece is called Radical Feminism 1 and was updated from another piece called The New Feminist Analysis, published 3 years earlier in Notes from the Second Year Women's Liberation. Krebs points out that the crux of the problem is that man has consistently defined woman not in terms of herself, but in relation to him. And woman has accepted this definition of herself, thereby becoming inferior. Echoing Beauvoir in 1949, she says, "Whatever biology may determine for us all, and the question is debatable, I think it is an obvious truth that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman or a man." She's pushing back on the idea that women's differences from men are natural or biologically given, and asking us to think about how they are created. She describes the social conditions for women at the time. Remember, this is 1973. How much pressure there is on women to find a man to marry, and how this looks like an attractive option for women at the time because it's better than the alternative. She says, "The economic discrimination against the working woman is highly conducive to her seeing marriage as liberation from ill-paid drudgery. She usually faces the prospect of being an underpaid worker in society's lowest echelons. She faces a discrimination based on sex, which racial groups no longer tolerate. So it is little wonder that her desire to find a husband is reinforced." And how is all this accomplished? Socialization into sex roles. Females are pushed into passiveness. Little boys and little girls are given different toys designed to develop different characteristics. They are dressed differently, one prepared for interaction and experimentation, the other as pretty objects. Girls are taught to relate to others socially, and boys are taught to be independent. Marriage and motherhood are conceived of as a woman's entire destiny and the fulfillment of her nature. Krebs points to the runaway success of books like Beauvoir's The Second Sex and Friedan's The Feminine Mystique as revealing exactly how frustrated women were about their situation. The feminine mystique, the idea that women are feminine, was a fraud and had caused a loss of identity for women. She says that slavery depends on convincing slaves that they are indeed inferior and that slavery isn't so bad. Then asks, the question for women is, what are the mechanics of our particular kind of oppression and how do we best fight it? It is because radical feminism takes the oppression of women as women to be its central concern. Radical feminism is concerned with the analysis of the oppression of women as women, that it is interested in institutions that plausibly perpetrate or perpetuate sex roles. Institutions like love, marriage, sex, masculinity, and femininity. The basic aim of radical feminism is that no characteristics, behavior, or roles be ascribed to humans on the basis of their sex. It is radical because it wants fundamental change to society in the ways that men and women relate to each other, which pervade almost everything else. Krebs has 4 imperatives: the liberation of all women from sex roles, full economic rights for women, without this they can't use their civil liberties, full control of reproduction to avoid being in slavery to the species, and the self-fulfillment of women and girls as human beings, rather than as females or as feminine. In order to mark this distinction between what she really is, her sex, and what she has been made to be, socialization into femininity, the second wave feminists introduced the sex-gender distinction. For them, gender meant something external to her, something that is done to her by others, by society, and because of history and tradition, and people with dominance working to protect their advantages. Hence, gender abolitionism, the idea that we should work as feminists to get rid of gender, the process that denies her the full set of human possibilities. And to return to a point from earlier, let me just reiterate that it's really important not to confuse gender abolitionism with masculinity and femininity abolitionism. Some of what we currently call femininity might be good, in which case the problem is punishing it in men, not rewarding it in women. So too for masculinity. Gender abolition isn't the abolition of all the content of what is constructed with gender norms. It is the abolition of its differential enforcement by sex. If we treated everyone the same and some people liked baking and for some reason we wanted to call baking feminine, then we would not be, as feminists, on a crusade to abolish baking. We'll return to this issue in much more detail in Lecture 5. Okay, a very brief part 5 just before we finish, comparing sex category abolitionism and gender abolitionism as solutions to patriarchy. Which of these is the best strategy for feminists depends on an empirical question, which is whether it is truly possible to eliminate racism, sexism, classism, ageism, homophobia, and so on, while yet acknowledging difference. Are we all pansexual, or are some people straight and some people gay, and that's fine? Are we all one race, or are some people black and some people white, and that's fine? At the risk of overdoing it, are we all just human, or are some people female and some people male, and that's fine? So if it can be shown that eliminating acknowledgement of difference is the necessary precondition for eliminating inequality, discrimination, and oppression, then we're on firmer ground in arguing for the elimination of sex categories. Although note the potentially serious costs that would have for science, given the reality of sex differences, not just in humans, but across the animal kingdom, and the explanatory role these differences play. And also for dating, for example, where it matters who we are attracted to and that we might end up pregnant. And on this matter of the importance of biological sex categories, I highly recommend Thomas Bogardus's forthcoming book. If eliminating any acknowledgement of difference is not a necessary precondition, then we're on firmer ground in arguing to retain sex categories, which, after all, are useful for a range of reasons, and instead arguing for the abolition of gender, understood as the socialization of female people into femininity. Seems to me that the burden is on the sex category abolitionists to show that difference will always lead to domination. If they can't, gender abolition just looks like the infinitely more sensible position. If you think I'm wrong, argue with me in the comments. This was the last of our 3 lectures on patriarchy. In the next 3 lectures, we're moving on to applied topics, and lecture 5 talking about femininity.